John, it's December. It's the end of the month. At the beginning of this year, we hadn't even talked about the idea of a podcast, and here we are recording this. I believe will be the 9th episode.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be released as the 9th episode, and the podcast we're going to be continuing now into 2024, and we already have a whole bunch of content and episodes set up, ready to go. Story Weavers is not going anywhere. We're just gaining momentum. Do you agree?
Yes, wholeheartedly.
Yeah. It's been so much fun. I know you and I say this a lot, but we've had such a fun time working on this podcast, and it's been coming along better than we could have expected. And the reception we've gotten so far has been fantastic, and we're looking forward to it growing and reaching more people and getting to interact with other people. So yeah, we just want to thank everyone who's been listening so far this year. You know, it's only been out for about 2 months, but it's not going anywhere.
Yes, we're here to stay.
Yeah. Hello and welcome to Story Weavers, the podcast where we discuss anything and everything story related.
Here, we'll delve into inspiration, plot, structure, character, and dialogue. Be it in books, movies, music, comics, television, or anything else, we'll be covering it from conception to reception.
We'll be discussing between ourselves as well as with other creators and fans about their experiences, routines, and techniques. Join us and find your next inspiration. We're your hosts, Dean Bradley
and John William Worth.
And this is Story Weavers. I like having the mic in the shot.
Yes, and also blocking the fan.
Yeah.
Just very artistic here. Welcome to Story Weavers. We're your hosts, John and Dean. And this week we're going to be discussing the second book of the month. This time it's Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. Originally published in the late 1930s.
1939.
1939.
Yep.
And it was serialized in 1940. It is a anti-war novel, a very anti-war novel, about a soldier who wakes up in a hospital. And he believes he's blind at first because he can't see, he can't hear, he doesn't have any sensations, so he thinks he's in a coma.
He's not even convinced that he's blind at that point. He realizes his head is wrapped in bandages.
Yes.
When he wakes up, he doesn't really realize anything's wrong. He just realizes he can't see.
Right. And as the book unfolds, you start to realize the extent of his injuries as he does. And the book is split into two halves. The first half is him discovering his new body and his new state of being, as well as reflecting upon his life up until that point. And the second half of the book is him rationalizing his place in the war, which I believe was World War I in this book. It's never truly specified, but it was written around after World War I and just before the start of World War II.
Well,
before the U.S.'s entry into World War II.
Yes, and it was said that, he his injury came from, like a mortar shell hitting him in a trench. Okay. I think it was a mortar shell hitting him in a trench, and that was trench warfare was quote popular in World War I. Not popular, just widely used. Widely used is a much better way to say that.
Yes, everyone loved it. But yeah, the second half of the book is him adjusting to his new life, or to his opinion, the lack thereof, and him trying to escape the boundaries of that new life and the limitations.
Yeah, a lot of it's just trying to understand how can he interact with his environment? How can he learn to tell time? How can he speak to someone on the outside with no arms, legs, eyes, nose, mouth, or ears?
Exactly, which I think that's part of what makes the book so powerful and so relatable, because it brings these little, almost ridiculous details that you might not think of into full focus, like someone who's blind, how do they tell the time other than being told it, for example, or someone who can't hear, how can they tell the time? It's little things like that. or just like even just the sensation of touch. If you no longer have hands and you can't touch something, just feeling it on your body, like when the nurse was like rubbing lotion on him, I believe. It's like those little things suddenly become so much more powerful and so much more important. And I think that's part of the power of the book,
Right.
or the story rather. Did we want to get into spoilers or
I was
leave it?
actually just about to bring that up. This is going to be a spoiler episode.
All right.
You know,
So-
we've been telling people if they want to read it, you know, for the last month they can, you know, if they want to skip over this episode and read it later or whatever, but we will be discussing spoilers because it's kind of hard not to talk about this book without discussing the ending of it.
Yes, especially I'm sure you've noticed at this point that I'm very evasive about what the extent of his injuries are, as well as the ending of the book. We could discuss that later in the episode. We could, if you want, or should we could bring it up now, whatever.
No, let's talk about it.
Okay, so the blunt truth of the book is that the main character, whose name is Joe, I don't believe a name is ever given in the book, but in the movie it is.
It is in the book.
It is in the book.
I mean,
Joe?
because when he's thinking about like his
Flashbacks.
memories and things like that, you know, people say his name. People say his name.
Joe, essentially, like Dean mentioned, was hit by a mortar shell in the trenches in World War I, and he essentially loses both legs, both arms, and all of his face.
Yeah, like
so he
his
is
face
blind,
is like
deaf, mute. And I believe he lost his nose as well. So I don't remember if he, so he is literally a sack of flesh lying in a hospital bed. So the only thing he can do is writhe around a little bit and he can feel the nurse and the doctors touching his torso. And this is all unraveled in the first 100 pages of the book. And it's done. I'll get into this in a bit, but I knew going in the extent of his injuries, and it was still shocking to see each one slowly revealed over the course of the book.
And it's
all told from his perspective. So
exactly.
It's his shocking realizations, and you almost feel the numbness as it continues to go on, how he starts to just resign himself. Like, you know, the first, I think he realizes he lost one arm. The first, and it was like this big moment, and then he realizes he lost his legs, and then as they start to pile on, he starts to become almost numb, and it just starts to feel like this avalanche of misery falling upon him. And it's like,
there's definitely this constant like pull and tug that he has with it, where he kind of goes, he's always, you know, upset and you know, depressed, obviously, but there are definitely times where whenever he focuses on something and tries to like solve a problem, trying to figure out what's going on, and there he gets kind of excited, and as a reader, like, you also get excited because you're like, oh my gosh, like what's he gonna try and do? What, you know, that was a big question I had going through the book. It was just like, where is the book going? Like, what, how, because I remember I knew the premise, but I was just like, what are we gonna talk about for 200 pages?
Right.
And
I remember I kept it vague for you
half.
Too. I didn't tell you many details about it. And even when you look at like the back of the book, it doesn't say much.
Yeah. I read like the last like 60 to 80 pages all in one sitting. I mean, couldn't put it down.
Yep. And just to complete the novel, the second half of the book, as I mentioned, is him reconciling with his current state. He does try to kill himself, but he has a tracheotomy, so he can't. And he decides that he wants to be an example of the soldiers, of the real soldiers that come back from these wars, damaged and broken. And I think it's like the image is like him in a glass coffin being toured around the country. Yeah. And he figures out Morse code.
Yeah.
And
so
one of the nurses,
he learns to communicate.
He bangs his head on the pillow, and the nurse figures it out. And this was like the heaviest moment in the book for me, is when at the ending a soldier comes in, I think, to speak with him, or a general, and they say, what you ask for is against regulations. Who are you? And it's that in that moment, he, as well as you, realize they're not going to help you, Joe. They don't care. They want to hide you.
They ask him, what do you want in Morse code? And he responds, out. He's like, I want out. And then when they basically say, no, we can't do that, you go through this. The whole book is told from the perspective of his mind.
It's first person.
Yeah. Anything that doesn't take place in his mind is literally just flashbacks of his life and him remembering his life and then coming back to the grim reality of his state. So, but they say they can't get out, and he starts trying to reason, why won't they let me out? And he goes, oh, well, it's probably too expensive. The care is probably too expensive. It's easier to leave me wherever I am. He doesn't even know what country he's in. He
Right.
finds ways to try and deduce it, but he doesn't know if he's in England, France. He's back home. He doesn't know how long he's been there, since he was able to start figuring out how to keep some sort of time or calendar.
Right. Well, the Morse code lets it out because he's speaking English, and they know, okay, he's American, and they can speak English. So wherever he is, but it's this giant void that he's trapped in, not just in himself, but just in general. Like it's like, and it's terrifying if you put yourself in those shoes. Like you are literally just a lump of flesh, powerless, and the one little bit of power he suddenly gets is kind of like shooed away to an extent. Like, okay,
basically, because that's when the real kind of political anti-war part of the book comes out, is when they're in there and asking him what he wants, and he says out, and he goes, he's thinking, it's too expensive. I know what I can do. He was like, I want to make sure no one else ends up in the situation I am. People need to know, what happens in war. And he said, I'll be basically like a traveling zoo. People can come pay and see the freak. He goes, but hopefully, people will realize I wasn't born this way. People made me this way. People I don't know forced me into this situation, kind of thing. And that's where a lot of that starts coming in. And he starts tapping a lot of that out in Morse code and all of his frustration. And that's when they were basically like, no, sorry, you're going to be here.
That's not the message we want the people to know.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the true anti-war element of the book. And that's the part that got Dalton Trumbo in so much trouble after its publication, because, the idea of, you lay your life down for your country, and here's a book that says, this is the price for that. This is the reality of it. It's gruesome. It's horrific. And guess what? The people at the top, you're a pawn. You're a foot soldier. They really don't care. They want to keep that image of a glory.
It is different to note nowadays too that at least in the U.S., we haven't had an active draft, I don't think, since World War II, if I'm not mistaken. Right. But the reason he was taken, was because he was drafted, and his girlfriend at the time, who he remembers, he basically says she's immortalized in his mind at 18 or however old she was, because that's the last he's ever going to know of her, and it's the last she ever knew of him.
Right.
But she begged him not to go. She says, you're going to die. And he was like, oh no, I'll be fine. They know what they're doing.
Right.
I want to go fight for my country.
It was like, to me, it was that kind of thing. It was the contrast of the blind patriotism of, serving country, helping your government, followed by the growing sentiment in the 50s and 60s that the government doesn't always have your best interests in mind. So, and they're using you. And, you think about it, he suffered a fate that could be considered worse than death. He is trapped, and he's going to go mad. Because he's trapped with his own mind.
He wished they would kill him. That's what he couldn't under. Oh, go ahead. Go.
I was going to say the very ending of the book is him essentially giving up and shutting down, and just kind of like the narrative for the first time kind of leaves him and goes into like this weird omnipotence. And like the final lines of the book are just like, point the way, you rulers of men, and we will point the gun, or something like that. And it's like just the thought that that's how it ends for him. He ends just shutting down, and it's just terribly depressing.
Because he asked for them to kill him. He was, because he's like, what? This isn't a life. There's nothing you can do, and they wouldn't even give him that mercy. And that's when he realized, like, they don't care, who I am. They don't care what I am. They don't care what I came from, but they're keeping me alive, and the doctors are impressed. That's like, what matters.
Yeah, it's like this is a sign of how resilient the human body is. It's like, great, but think about what's going on inside the mind that's still preserved.
Yeah.
But so that's the outline, and I guess the general direction of Johnny Got His Gun.
So let's get into a little bit of what we know about Dalton Trumbo and Dalton Trumbo's life, because that influenced the book, it influenced his writings leading up what's it called? Tale of the Arcs, yeah, which was basically about someone who works in a concentration camp in Nazi Germany, and he basically tries to get in the person's head and tell a story from their mentality. And obviously that was, and probably it would still be today, you know, very,
Yes.
very controversial. So that didn't help. But you know,
No.
then he got in, he wrote this. He was a member of the American Communist Party.
Yep.
He
And
was,
as I mentioned,
he
the book
spoke
was
before
published in
Congress.
19. Yep, and the
Yeah.
book was published in 1939 and serialized in 1940, and I believe it was the Communist Party USA magazine. So, and I do know that later on he was blacklisted in Hollywood. I believe they were called the Hollywood 10, who were screenwriters or workers in Hollywood who were just blacklisted because they were part of the Communist Party, even just suspected of it. Because I think he left the Communist Party at a certain point. And they were still going after him for his prior involvement.
I don't know if it was before or after his Hollywood blacklisting, but I mean, the U.S. Congress did like interview him and grill him about being a member of communism and, you know, pushing a communist agenda.
Well, that was after Johnny got his gun. I would say, because I think the McCarthy era was the 50s, I believe, right? During the Red Scare.
Yeah.
And that was one of the big things. Like he was grilled, and Hollywood just got rid of him because he was a liability. And the movie that I know he won an Oscar, I think it was for Roman Holiday, which I think was an Audrey Hepburn movie. But he had to do it under a pseudonym, and he couldn't be there to accept the award.
A lot of his stuff was released under a pseudonym.
Yep. And the movie that got him out of it, I think, was Spartacus. Yeah. Because who was it? I think it was Kirk Douglas, was the star working with director Stanley Kubrick, and they really wanted Dalton Trumbo to write the script because he's a marvelous writer. Except because of the blacklisting, the studio didn't want to have his name on the movie. So Stanley Kubrick said, I'll take credit for it. And I guess Kirk Douglas was so angry, rightfully so, at that statement that he said, nope, put Dalton Trumbo's name on it. And they said that movie essentially ended the blacklisting era. Like all the blacklisted actors and producers and writers started coming back because it's like, yeah, no one cared that Dalton Trumbo's name was on the movie. Like, because by this point, I think McCarthy was irrelevant. Like they realized that what he had done was horrible. So, but that's a little history about, that's the history I'm most familiar with Dalton Trumbo. The Hollywood side of him.
But then again, we might as well, while we're talking about that, you know, he produced and directed the film Johnny Got His Gun in 1971, over 30 years after its original publication. And it's very, very true to the book. I mean, it's one of, when it comes to film adaptions, it's one of the truest, just in terms of being faithful to the book and keeping all the scenes in there. And the cool thing about it being done by Trumbo himself was he was able to do things in the film that wouldn't necessarily have worked as well, you know, in a novel. Have you seen the whole film?
I haven't seen the whole thing, so I was going to ask you what did he do differently? I'm intrigued to know, because
there were a couple things. Go ahead.
Yeah, because there's like several parts. Because when I first read the book, before I knew that he made a movie based on it, this was like high school me saying this was like, oh, you know, how would you film this? Like, it's entirely internal monologue, and it's like you can't have a movie focused on a lump of flesh, or entirely told in narration. And I think like in 2008 or something, there was a stage play made of it. Guy, it's a one-man stage play where he basically is on stage, with and in the background he's an actor walking around the stage, and in the background is the bed with him laying in it. And you never see it because, again, it's a very gruesome sight. But it's just like it's a silhouette, and it's just him walking around the stage narrating and you know, portraying the novel. And it's like, I saw that, I was like, okay, that is one way to do it, but how would you do it in a movie? And I always had trouble figuring that out. And then I saw clips from it where it's like, you know, you see him and you see the flashbacks and everything. And like you said, Donald Sutherland is Jesus in the movie.
that cracked me up, you know, just used to Donald Sutherland playing different roles. And I was like, oh my gosh, I was not expecting Donald Sutherland to be Christ, you know, in this. But no, it was good. Honestly, I was expecting both the book and the film, before I got into them to be a lot gorier just because of the subject matter. But they're not at all in the film. You never see his face. You never see any of his injuries. You see his forehead and you see his chest, and that's about it. But there were a couple things about the movie that I liked that he did kind of change a little bit. There was a scene in the film that I don't believe was in the book, where the nurse realizes that he's like asking for death, and she puts like a clip on his trachea tube to cut off his oxygen supply. And while that's happening, that's when, the general comes in and says, you can't do that, and basically kicks her out, closes the window, and just kind of like leaves him in there by himself. There's a scene in the film in the bakery.
Right.
It's a flashback from when he worked at the bakery, and his manager stands there at the front trying to get everyone's attention. And he goes, "I'm the boss. This is champagne. Merry Christmas." But he says it over and over and over again as the whole scene plays out, as everyone else is talking constantly in the background. That's just going on. "I'm the boss. This is champagne. Merry Christmas." And I think he's kind of alluding to the fact that he's the boss, or, and the people who made this decision to send these people to war, they're celebrating, they're having a good time. They're not the ones on the front lines risking their lives.
They're in the background
for things like that. But yeah, it was a really, really fun scene. And one of the other things I also really liked in the film, so the scene from the book where the nurse she kind of like realizes that he hasn't done the Morse code yet, but she realizes that he's conscious and he's aware of what's going on around him. She kind of touches his forehead, and he nods his head. And it's when she starts writing around the time he starts writing Merry Christmas on his chest. So yeah, I think this all is around the same time. And then when she realizes that, she kind of, she's trying to figure out what she can do for him. And so, she pleasures him in the book. And it's not graphic. It's more implied than anything else. And I was curious to see how that scene was going to be in the film, because it's kind of the only instance where someone's able to give him any sort of gratification, not just sexually, but in any way. But
just writing Merry Christmas on his chest.
He just, but that happens in the book, and they have that scene in the film, but it's very much just kind of implied. There's no like crass motion of her arm going up and down under the covers or anything like that. It's more just, it's sensual, and it's very it's heartfelt. It doesn't come across as gross or anything like that. So I think kind of just the way he portrayed that scene in the film was really nice. Okay.
Yeah, because I guess I haven't seen the whole thing. I've just seen clips of it, and I've seen the Metallica video, of course.
Right. Yeah.
So for those listening,
let's talk about that.
So for those listening, it's Metallica's music video for their song "One."
Yeah, I was gonna say it's off the album "And Justice for All," which came out in 1988, I believe.
Yep. Uses extensive clips from the movie, and they actually bought the rights to the film so that they could show it at concerts while they're touring, like in the background while they're playing. And Dean, you actually mentioned you're familiar with the background of how that music video came to be.
Yeah, so I looked into it because I knew. So I've been a Metallica fan for years, for a long time, and I had seen the video for One a long time ago, and I knew there were shots interspersed of like war, but at the time I didn't realize they were from this film. And I remember kind of looking after I was reading the book and I figuring out what it was about, and I kind of like connected the pieces. I was like, oh, I wonder if this is the basis for One. But it turns out there was an interview done with Lars Ulrich, who's the drummer for Metallica, and he was asked that question, and he said that it wasn't technically the inspiration. The inspiration for the song One came about when him and James Hetfield, the singer and guitar player, were having a discussion about what it would be like to just be a consciousness, and not really have any other senses, but just have a consciousness. And they said, well, how would that ever happen? And they came upon the idea of, well, what about a soldier of war who loses his limbs, and the lines in the song, losing my arms, losing my legs, losing my sight, losing my hearing. So like that's how the idea of it came along. And then I don't know if they were already familiar with the film or if they happened to see the film after they had written the song and were just like, holy shit, this is exactly what we wrote this song about. So it's kind of a cool coincidence. And it came out, less than 2 decades after the movie was released. But that was not Metallica's first anti-war song. On Master of Puppets, they had a song called Disposable Heroes, which is basically exactly what this book is about as well.
Disposable Heroes. Yep.
Yeah. So it was kind of fun to see something like this, making it into my wheelhouse in, the metal world.
Well, it just shows how influential the book was, because before it was introduced to me back in high school, I had never even heard of it, but then I read the book and I started just seeing like little signs of its influence. One of them being the music video, another being the film. And then you also hear like people still talk about it every once in a while. Like I'm living in Arizona right now, and I was at Savers a few years ago and they had a copy of Johnny Got His Gun on the shelf in Savers in Arizona. And it's like, oh, okay, that's not something I would expect to see here.
Right.
It's a very anti-war, pacifist novel. So it just shows its influence, I would say.
Yeah. I discovered it last year. I read a book called Thomas Young's War.
Yes.
I had found out about that book. Eddie Vedder, the singer for Pearl Jam, who is an activist as well, he got to know Thomas Young, who was an American Iraq war veteran who became paraplegic as a result of his service in Iraq. And basically, I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but this soldier, Thomas Young, was, he signed up to go to war. He signed up to go to Afghanistan because he wanted to find the people responsible for 9/11. So it was a very patriotic thing. But when he got shipped out, they were told as they were shipping out, oh, you're not going to Afghanistan, you're going to Iraq. And nobody understood why they were going to Iraq. And him and all of his comrades were basically saying, well, this isn't why we signed up. Like, this isn't why we're going over here. Why are we going there? And it was basically, the book was written, I think it was written by some friends of his, maybe, just kind of about his life and his experience being a paraplegic and his experience in being in war. And it was a similar kind of outcome that Thomas Young ended up having was, who am I? Like, what was the point of me doing this? I signed up for one thing and they sent me to do something else. And now my life is nothing. It's very expensive for my care and all of this. And they're not taking care of me. And
it's just the concept of which this book also wrestles with, the idea that you realize all of this work and all of this pain was essentially for nothing. And it's like, that's the worst realization, especially when, like in this
World
book,
War II happened
Thomas Young,
right after.
it cost so much.
Yeah.
And so that's the thing, like the historical elements of the book. This was published just before World War II. So and this was just before, what was it? I think Pearl Harbor happened just before the U.S. entered the war. So the idea of an anti-war novel portraying war for the gritty, violent thing that it is, being published just before to me, like World War II was justified, our entry to it, because there was a lot of evil we were fighting. I could see why people were like hated the book at the time. And I mean, at least to recount my introduction to the book, because I mentioned I learned about it in high school. At that time the US had just entered Iraq, 9/11, and we were in Iraq and fighting this, people were slowly realizing was an endless war.
Yeah.
And I think it was in like 10th grade or 11th grade, a girl named Gabrielle, who we all called Gabby, she just was reading this book, and she just pulled me aside at some point and she said, John, you got to read this. She was, because she knew like politically we were kind of aligned.
Right,
Like
what was
almost
going
everyone in
on.
the school was very, very aware of the war, very
Right.
attuned to it, and very much against it, especially since like one of the seniors who was 2 years ahead of us, he enlisted, and then we found out about a year or two later he'd been killed.
Oh, jeez.
So I didn't know him particularly well, but it was just like one of those shocking things. It's like,
Sure.
yeah, this is
Definitely.
war. But no,
Yeah.
Gabby introduced this book to me. And she told me nothing about it. All she said was it's this guy who basically has his body is destroyed. And
Hmm.
that's it. And I read it. And at first I read it like I was a teenager. I was like, okay, cool. It's going to be graphic and it's going to be. And then I was reading it, and just like how you said, the book is not gory, but it's like
It's a very psychological,
and that made it
psychologically heavy
heavier.
book.
And
Yeah.
it's like it made such an impact on me as a creator, but also as someone who like looks at the world,
Hmm.
empathic, seeing other people and like realizing like, yeah, this is what it's like coming back from the war, even if like this is extensive and
Right.
this is over the top,
This
but
is
it's
an
like there
extreme
is
case,
damage.
but it happens.
Exactly. PTSD. I mean, we talk there, I've always heard stories even after World War II of all the soldiers coming back. And it's just like how with the enlisted men, they would use, my dad told me this story, they would use the same soldiers over and over again for all the
Hmm.
operations. And their logic was
Flight Catch 22.
not quite. They didn't want to damage everyone. Once they had people, they wanted to keep it contained. They said, if they're already seeing the horror, we don't want to spread it. But then those people had to come back
Hmm.
to the real world, and the real world was not forgiving to them.
Right.
So it's like so that I remember reading the book in high school, and it's
Hmm.
like I said, that ending just hit me like a shovel. And I
Yeah.
remember just telling Gabby afterwards, it's like, you were completely right.
Yeah. And it
So
subverted expectations big time for me.
100%,
Yeah.
100%.
But actually, going back to Thomas Young real quick,
Mhm.
I found out about the book because I believe it was Thomas Young's mother started doing a lot of activism against the Iraq War, and someone
Mhm.
told her to read Johnny Got His Gun. And she
Yes.
read it, and it hit so close to home that she started taking that out to her rallies and where she was doing activism, and basically she was going up to mothers of soldiers, or talking to people who were talking about enlisting in the military, and basically saying, read this book first and let me tell you what happened to my son, kind of thing. So I mean, it's definitely been used for political reasons,
Oh,
and I think
yes.
that's something Dalton Trumbo would probably be quite proud of, because I believe that was part of the reason he wrote the book.
Well, it was. I mean, it's been a while since I've read the introductions to the copy I have, because I still have the same copy that I read back in high school,
Hmm.
yellow pages and all. And there were two introductions, one just after the book came out, and it won the National Book Award, which the initial reaction to the book was very positive, because this was
Right.
a year or two before the US entered the war.
Right.
And it was this kind of happy introduction of, okay, yeah, I wrote this book. And then the next one was written around the time the movie came out, and it was him
Hmm.
reflecting on being blacklisted and the
Yeah.
government hating him. And there's a reference in there to one senator or some governor somewhere getting, like, he said the book was called Johnny Get Your Gun. He couldn't even get the title of the book right. And Dalton Trumbo made that a point, saying these people don't even know what the book's really about. All they know is
Yeah.
it's anti-war, it's graphic, it's all the things they don't like.
Yeah. But it's
And
not
that
as graphic as you would think. It's
it's
almost
not, but
yeah, it's just it's heavy. The
it's heavy.
topic is very heavy, but
Right,
I
but it's a
wouldn't say
lot like
it's graphic.
the
Yeah.
fear mongering. It shows you that the fear mongering we still see today in many ways was there then as well.
Oh yeah.
It's just it took a different form. Like instead of going like Fox going after the Mass Effect games because they have sex in them when it's a couple kissing scenes, it's the same thing with this book. They had no idea what it was about, and again, it wasn't in their best interest to have something like this on the shelf where normal Americans who should be enlisting
Yeah.
could see it. And that
Which goes back. Oh no, go ahead.
books I was going to say, um, the controversy of the book and how
Hmm.
it's like a very touchy subject and how it's
Right.
still considered a very, very and flaming novel. Do you think that controversy is deserved based on the content of the book itself, or do you think it's because of its history?
Right. It's
And
it's 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 context. You know, we talk
yes.
about this in almost every single episode when it comes to any sort of art or media.
Mhm.
You know, as just a standalone book. I mean, it's fantastic. It's very well written.
Mhm.
It brings up lots of different emotions and feelings and thoughts as you go through it, and it's engaging. Not to, you know, it's not happy at all. It's a
No.
very upsetting book.
Yes.
But it's a very good book and it's very well done. And it was just like you said, when it came out, it won the national award. You
National
know,
Book
it was
Award. Yeah.
very popular. It was a well-written book, but as soon as it started being used for political purpose, or in this sense, being taken away for political purpose, is that the controversy? Is you know, what is the
Right.
controversy? Is the controversy the contents of the book? I don't think so at all. You know,
Neither do I.
there are a lot of books out there about soldiers of war. This happens
Mhm.
to be about one of them who had a terrible experience.
Right.
You know,
And
and
I
and it is fiction.
exactly. I mean, it was probably inspired by vague things that happen in real life, like someone who lost
Sure.
like both legs and both
Yeah.
arms, for example.
Well,
Dalton Trumbo
part.
probably saw that story and was like,
Hmm.
what would that be like?
I was gonna say a lot of the flashbacks are very autobiographical. You know,
Hmm.
Donald
Hmm.
Trumbo worked in a bakery as a kid.
Hmm.
You know, and there, I read a little bit about that, and yeah, a lot of the scenes, I think probably
Hmm.
a lot of the relationship with his father in the book, a
Very
lot of that's
autobiographical.
probably autobiographical.
Write what you
So I
know.
just wanted
That's
to
what they
point that
say.
out. Yeah.
Yep. Hmm. No, I agree with you about the context thing because even the book's message, if you think about it, what's it saying? War is horrible. That's something that everyone knows.
Yeah.
That whole concept of, yes, war is evil, but then all of a sudden, when a war is presented, it's supposed to be in your best interest to go fight. And it's that
I,
conundrum to
yeah,
me.
he's
And it's
just
like,
questioning whose best interest is it,
exactly, which
and
again,
it still could be quote for the greater good in the best interest, but understanding the casualties and bringing the realities of those casualties and making them so visceral,
yep. It,
makes you kind of second guess and question yourself, like, is it worth it? And that's,
right.
I don't know if that's a question anyone can really answer, because you'll never know what the consequences are
Yeah.
one
And
way or the
even if
other.
you experience it, you're a sack of flesh. You can't
Yeah.
communicate it.
Yeah. You just
And
have
that's
to
the thing.
make
Like,
decisions based on what you know now.
yep. And that's probably why they were fearful of this book, or like, the politicians. And even now, I would say, like, if this book started to blow up now because of all the conflicts going on all over the world, some politicians in some countries probably would clamp down on it and say, no, you can't read it, because it's that, like how you mentioned catch 22 earlier. This is a bit of a catch 22. This is a
Yeah.
book that housewives can read. They could just go to a grocery store, pick it up and read it, and they're not ones who are going to experience conflict or war or violence like that, but it's going to give them a very visceral look into what it's like. And the
Right.
fact that it's almost a century old
Hmm.
tells you that it does have a lot of staying power. This is a book that, another 100 years from now, if the human race is still around, we're doubtless going to be still fighting each other. It's still going to have the same message and it's still going to mean the same thing. So it's that catch
Hmm.
22 of people are violent, maybe not inherently, but they're driven to conflict. Yet we all know that it's evil and that it's wrong and that it's horrible.
Right.
So, and you're stuck somewhere in that middle. And it's like,
It's
that's why
the dichotomy of it.
at the end of the day, that's part of the reason to me why the book, sorry, I'm ranting, but it's like
No.
the book, like why it stuck with me and hits so hard, because there is no right answer to that question. It's like,
Hmm.
do you defeat evil, but you're going to
Or do
destroy,
you suffer the consequences?
you're going to sell, because it's like, yes, you might defeat evil. You're going to be a horribly broken, mangled thing by the end of it. And it's like, what do you value more? And to each individual, there is no wrong answer, but there is no right answer. And
Yeah.
that's part
Well,
of what drives people crazy.
Yeah, and that
Yes.
was part of Trumbo's point too, I think, was just that he was like, I'm a person, like I have a history, I have a past, I have a life.
Hmm.
I'm not just a pawn. And what I want to tell, all of these people before they make the decision to go is to understand that like you still have a choice.
Right.
The choice may be to defect and you may end up in prison, but his point is based on the situation I am in, with
Hmm.
no arms, no legs, no sight, none of this. He goes, literally any situation is better than this. He said at one point, I would rather be a prisoner and being tortured and being cut, because I could
Hmm.
actually feel something, I could experience something, and I haven't done that for years.
Right. I
Yeah.
agree.
But the
Um,
other thing I wanted to bring up, so concurrently while I was reading Johnny Got His Gun, I'm still reading it. I'm reading a book by Karen Armstrong called Fields of Blood,
mhm,
A History of Religion and Violence.
mhm,
And I'm not going to get too into it, but as a historian, one of the things she points out, she goes back to early ancient human civilization and, basically how agrarian civilization came about. And wars, they're almost always started for resources, for lack of resources, or wanting more resources to collect for yourself. And she basically said humanity would have never built civilizations uh, without war and without
mhm.
violence.
Right.
And that's one of the biggest struggles that a lot of people have, is that, unfortunately, war is necessary. Unfortunately, having a military and having a defense is necessary, because
Right.
there's always going to be other people and other states and other governments that want to, take over or take your resources, or tell you how to live your life. All of this, that's always going to be there. So it's that very difficult dichotomy. Yes, war is terrible, killing another human is terrible, but at the same time, like it's going to happen, and you kind
Mhm.
of just have to accept it, as horrible as that sounds.
Right.
um and you cannot support it, you cannot
Mhm.
support war, but you also, but at
You
the
will
same
still pay
time
a
you also
price.
have to understand that there are consequences both ways,
Right.
you know
Like how I said, there is no right answer, there is no wrong answer,
right.
but
Yeah.
all there is, and this is a very nihilistic standpoint, but let's face it, the book is a nihilistic
Oh
story.
yes,
It's a
very
very
much so.
depressing story, is that there's no winning in this.
Right.
And it's like, yeah, there is no winning and there is no right answer. It's like, even if you escape it, like you said, even if you become a like the people who fled to Canada to escape the draft
Hmm.
in Vietnam and such, there's a name for the draft dodgers.
Yeah.
Okay, you still lost your home. You can never go
Right.
back.
Right.
And even if you do go back, there's always going to be that feeling. Like, I believe it was the author of Neuromancer, a famous science
Hmm.
fiction book. I forget. I think William Gibson was his name. He was a draft dodger. And I don't think he would have ever been drafted because I think he had a medical condition I read somewhere. But he said it was the principle of the thing. And it's just that whole idea that it still feels like you got cut out of your home. And even when you
Hmm.
go back, you don't really belong there anymore because it feels like a betrayal.
Right.
And again, that's why, like a lot of good art, this book doesn't give you an answer to anything. It's not
No.
trying to solve the problem of war. It's not trying to find peace, even though like there's the peace sign on the cover of the book.
Right. It's
It's
just
not trying
bringing
to,
the reality of war.
and then it's laying it in your lap and saying, what are you going to do? What do you feel? And again,
Right.
that's probably another part of its lasting power, is the fact that it doesn't hold your hand. Well, it holds your hand until the very end, and then it lets you go. Like as soon as Joe shuts down
Hmm.
and
It
basically
basically,
just,
it tells, it's all about identity.
it is. And it asks that question. What are you going to do? You've read this story. You've seen the pain.
Yeah.
This is what it's like. What do you think? And
Right. And again, even if you're one of those people that do still want to go and, and risk your life, is
you
but the, but the,
understand it.
but the, like I was saying, the big difference was, back in World War One, it was a draft. He didn't have a choice.
Right.
Our military nowadays, our modern military, they do a lot of recruiting, but at the same time, there are also a lot of military benefits,
And also there's a
housing
lot more
and
technology on our side now with drones and unmanned aircrafts of all sorts. It's like you don't really need that many boots on the ground anymore. It's more like a romantic idea at this point when people are saying like, oh yeah, we're gonna
right.
have boots on the ground in the Middle East. It's like it's not as
But
necessary.
that also, that also raises the question, of taking the humanity out of war,
Right.
because now you're going and killing people, and
There's that
you don't,
detachment.
the detachment, you don't have that visceral experience that would maybe keep you from doing it in the future, you
Right.
know yeah,
That's why
it's
that's why a lot of the people came back damaged because they got to see what it looks like when someone's skull is blown apart and they see the insides dripping out. It's like it's a horrific sight that either scars you or changes you, and when it changes you, it's usually not for the better.
right.
Um, Now, like you said, it's becoming much more like a video game to an extent where it's like, oh yeah, I can kill all these people and it's fine because I'm not actually doing it. I'm just telling a machine to go do it for me.
War, as I said in that video I made earlier, war is just, it's so complex. There's so
It
many moving
is.
factors, and if in an ideal world there wouldn't be war, but there's limited resources and there's a lot of people that need them, and
Mm-hmm.
as human race and human civilization continues, a lot of that is being concentrated ever more into the hands of a few who are dictating all of it.
Right. Exactly. It's being concentrated on the top, and like how you mentioned earlier, the like the recruitment. That's another
Hmm.
thing that I clearly because I saw like Fahrenheit 9/11, I believe it was. Yeah. Yeah. Because again, around the time when I read this book, this was a little after the Dixie Chicks incident, where it's like they
Hmm.
badmouthed George Bush and they were
Blacklisted
put
from country radio.
blacklisted. And I remember seeing their music video, "Not Ready to Play Nice" or "Not Ready to Get to Make Nice," it was
Yeah.
called. And I'm not a huge country fan, but I remember watching that music video before school one day.
Hmm.
And it's like the messaging could not be clearer. They're just giving a big fuck you to all the people who hated them and said, this is what freedom of speech is. I can have my opinion. And
Right.
war is bad. It was this whole romantic idea of, well, if you don't support George Bush and you don't support the Iraq war, you're just not American. And it was just like, again, how you were talking about like the dichotomy of things. It's like you either are or aren't. And they're like, no, it doesn't have to be that way. And the whole idea of war is just bad. That should always be the last resort, especially when the Iraq war came to an end and you came to realize, like, and this is my opinion, so I might infuriate some people by saying this, but the whole point of it, there was no weapons of mass destruction. Bush quietly admitted it many years later with Obama. And you found out that a lot of it was because we wanted the oil and Saddam Hussein threatened Bush Jr.'s daddy at some point. So this was just a revenge tour. That's why, like how you mentioned with Thomas Young, suddenly everything went from Afghanistan to Iraq.
And
And
no
for
one knew
all those
why.
years, bin Laden was hiding in what was it, like Saudi Arabia? And
Pakistan.
Pakistan, we couldn't go in to get him. And he was actually on a flight at some point. But because he was with some princes, we wouldn't shoot the plane down. And it's like all of this was just falling in on me and us as teenagers. All of these facts, because the internet was a thing, it kind of showed the fallacy, is that the right
Yes.
word, of war, like
Yes.
the veil they put over it,
Hmm.
like it's this big noble thing, but then you're just seeing greed, revenge, anger, like that you just saw the pettiness of some big, sorry, weak men with thin
Yeah.
skin. And that was a long way to get to the point, was with that how you mentioned the recruiting was aggressive at
Yes.
that time. Like it was borderline a draft. Like I remember a clip from Fahrenheit 9/11, and they did it in my hometown too. They would, if you were a teenager, they would follow you and say, like, don't you want to fight for your country? Don't you want to stand up for American? It's like, I'm going to college, buddy.
Yeah.
Like I'm an American, but I want to learn things. I'm also like 17 years old
Yeah.
and seeing things like this, like Johnny Got His Gun, seeing the movie and any anti-war stuff, it turns you off from wanting to not throw your life away, because the military is a great thing to do if you want to,
Right.
but it also makes you realize, like, look, if there's a war and you actually have to go over there and fight, It's not good.
Right.
So
Yeah.
anyway, that was my tirade, and yeah, lower curtain.
But you
There
know, it's
was,
just it's a book that seems so simple in its premise. You
and
know,
it's
the
not that
thought
long.
of
It's like 200 pages.
of a man who is conscious, but can't really communicate with the outside world. He's stuck where he is.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's so much in there,
Right.
and it's so it's you know, war is a concept that will always be around as long as human civilization's around.
Mm-hmm.
And so this book and its message will always be relatable, whether you agree with it or not is irrelevant,
Right.
you know.
It'll always be relevant. There was actually one last question I did want to ask you, since you saw the movie and you read the book. And Dalton Trumbo was the author of the book, obviously, as well as the director and screenwriter of the movie. What do you think went through his mind? And why do you think he made the decisions he did when he was adapting and directing and creating, taking something that was purely psychological and then putting it in a visual medium? And do you think he succeeded in that?
I think he succeeded very well. You know, the character of Joe, there's a faceless narrator basically, for his character, for his consciousness and his inner thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there was always something active going on screen. Usually,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were some shots that were like just him laying there and him speaking, but there was almost something going on screen. And the what he was able to do with the film that he didn't really do in the book. And again, I don't know if this was a creative decision specifically for the film or after the book had been out for a while and he had digested it, you know, for years in ways maybe he could have improved it, because as
Mm-hmm.
we know, as artists, you know, you're never done. You
Right.
know, you know, you have to find a point where it's good enough and put it out. But you know, it's never done. It's a never ending process.
Right.
Um, but the book is, it definitely has it's a little bit more linear. It does have like the flashbacks, but the flashbacks are more chronological,
Mm-hmm.
you know, with it, you know, the first one being him with, you know, Kareen and spending his first night, you know, with her. It was the only night he'd ever been with a woman.
Mm-hmm.
um
I remember that
but
scene.
it does that kind of, it does the flashbacks a little bit more sequentially, whereas in the book, it's much more stream of consciousness. And
Mm-hmm.
the one thing in the book too, the only punctuation in the book is periods.
Yep.
There's no
I know.
commas, there's no quotations, I don't believe. um
There are
which
quotations, but there's no
it's
commas.
only
There's no. Yep.
okay. Okay, so I guess there are quotations when other people are speaking.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
there are no commas anywhere in the book, and that is to show the stream of consciousness style. And so I think having all the flashbacks in different times works better in the book,
Yeah.
because the whole point is it's just his mind going where it goes depending on what he's thinking about at the time. You know, is he trying to figure out what time it is, or you know, the nurse touches his head and that reminds him, you know, of this, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, something happens and he remembers, you know, the incident of the fishing rod with his dad, or he remembers the day his dad died, and things like that. So where in the book or in the film, you know, it's much more chronological.
Mm-hmm. And do you think, this is another question I came up with while you were speaking? Because the movie was made roughly 30 something
It
years
was
after the book came
32
out.
years after the original
32 years.
publication is when the film premiered. Yeah.
And of course, during that time, because he was blacklisted from Hollywood, he was part of a congressional hearing. There was all the controversy, the pushback for the novel's anti-war stance. Obviously, that colored the film adaptation. Like, I read one brief blurb between a doctor and a nurse, or no, a doctor and a priest. And the priest says, "I'll pray for him, but I won't risk jeopardizing his faith." And he blames the doctor, like, "This is your problem, not mine.
Yeah.
This isn't a
Right.
crisis of faith. This is a crisis of reality."
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
do,
I don't think that was in the book either.
it
I don't
wasn't,
think there
because
is.
it's all
Yeah.
told internally. So that's the thing. The movie
Right.
made it external, which I'm not sure how. It's a different story at that point, because the book is very much focused, laser focused on a single
Yeah.
thing. The movie has to be. That's part of that unfilmable thing that I remember
I hadn't
thinking
really
when I was
I hadn't
younger.
really thought about that, but I mean that's a good point.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe this was Donald Trumbo's way of kind of showing like this is what was actually going on while he was in the bed.
Right.
This is this is more of kind of the behind the scenes, not just what he was able to infer by the sounds of steps of people walking in, trying to figure out who's in the room and
Right.
why they're there. We're actually seeing what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
As more of a certainty. And I think the scene with the priest was interesting because it was basically these army generals seeing, this soldier in this state, and they're trying to find some way to justify it and make themselves feel better about it. And the priest was basically like, that's not my issue.
Right. See,
that's your problem.
That's the one thing I was going to say at first, was that making all of the going outside of Joe and seeing what was going on around him could dilute the power of the story as well as the message. But Dalton Trumbo, being the original creator, he was still very conscious of how, of making it so that even when you see the people outside, you still see the hypocrisy. You see the kind of like the lust for carnage to an extent. And the fact that these men needed to make themselves feel good. It's like the message is still there. It's just now it's spread out.
It's just presented differently.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But what I was going to, sorry.
I was just gonna say, well, and the other thing that about him being both the author and the producer and director of the film is, usually when a book is adapted to film, directors want to find a way to make it their own. They want to put their stamp on it. But in this case, he didn't have to do that. He didn't have to say this is my film, because it was already his book. It was already his story, and he was able to just add on to it. And so there's no questions about like, oh, I wonder if that was a good, creative decision in terms of, the reality or the truthfulness, in quote, of the story. But it doesn't matter because it is Dalton Trumbo's story. So it 100% is all the decisions that were made were 100% Dalton Trumbo.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fun because I was actually reading last night. I was looking at like the trivia about the film. A director named Luis Buñuel, I always have trouble with the name, was supposed to direct it originally. He was known as a very like experimental filmmaker, a very inventive one. And he has a very, very interesting visual style, and he tells like very strange stories.
Kind of like Kubrick.
Exactly. Let me just see, because I think, The Discreet Charm of the Bourgeoisie. I watched that movie when I was in college, and it's this very comedy, very weird movie showing like people just trying to have a dinner, and it's always interrupted by like a political revolution, a bunch of animals walking through, like just all these random things. And it's like, I remember I read that trivia last night. I was like, that would have been really interesting to see him make the movie.
His version of it. Yeah,
exactly. Because Dalton Trumbo's version is one, but then seeing someone take it and move it somewhere else and say, okay, no, I want to be like this. I just imagine something like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, like like Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet going in and out of each other's minds. And it's, but now what I also wanted to ask was, what do you think the movie would have been like? And do you think it would have been as good if it had been made soon after the book had come out in the 40s? I gotcha.
I don't know if I have an answer to that. I don't know, because I wasn't around in the 40s. I don't know what the sentiment would have been.
Well, remember at the time, like say a year after
film,
the book had come.
I don't know how popular was film. At that point, how many people were everyday people going to the movies, or it was only or you know what I mean?
Yep. Everyday
like
people
I don't know how many people would have experienced it versus how many people. I feel like, books were more easily accessible back then than films were, because you had to go to the theater. Whereas nowadays, they're both very easily accessible, and films are shorter and take less time to digest.
Not necessarily. So books were still a very popular thing back then, because they could do things that
That's
movies
my point.
couldn't show.
That's my
mostly
point,
in the violence and the negativity, because the production code was in full sway at that point in Hollywood. So like the idea of being anti-war, you could, but you couldn't be very anti-war like this, very blunt about it. You still had to have heroism at the end, like the ending of the movie. If there was like a movie adaptation of the book, it probably would have ended with Joe getting some weird surgery that would have cured him. Or
Right.
like the idea of him wanting suicide, it's like or wanting death, it's like the production code would have immediately said you can't show that.
Yeah.
So it almost begs the question, like, did Dalton Trumbo ever think I would love to know if he ever thought about this being turned into a movie in the 40s, and
I would assume he did, because he was involved. I mean,
he was involved very early on.
He was writing for a long time, and he had a lot of writings that went unpublished for a very long time.
Oh yeah.
But he was well invested in the film industry. So I would imagine, even as he was writing the book, he was probably thinking, what could this scene look like?
Yep.
You know, I don't imagine, you know, I assume whenever you're writing your books, you know, you see them as films in your mind, and then you're basically writing out, you know, what you see.
Oh yes.
In a sense. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I had a poetry professor once literally tell me that the paragraphs in my book, in my stories, and the lines of my poems were literally shots.
Yeah.
Like she said, like I could see it, like how they were cutting between different shots, and you could even see dissolves, like how the lines would go in or something. She was like, you could see that. It's like
you have a filmmaker's mind.
A filmmaker's mind, but I tell everything through the written word.
Right.
And that's why I think Dalton Trumbo was successful in both fields, screenwriter and author, because he understood that like what you could do in one, you can't do in the other, but he knew how to translate it or when to cut, which is good, because that means he was okay being ruthless with himself. Like he was okay. Oh, I love this part, but it won't work. I need to cut it. So, but that's the mechanics of it.
Yeah. Though I will say, I think the vast majority of scenes in the book are in the film. You know, there's a couple small things added. A lot of the dialogue is word for word, which also leads me to believe that he was imagining it as a film when he was writing, because we've talked about that before. Oftentimes when you're, you know, writing a script for an adaptation or an adaption, however you want to say it, my dad and I were arguing about it, and both are correct. Both are correct.
They both are correct, yeah.
But when you're adapting a book into a film, oftentimes the dialogue can be very awkward when it's directly taken off of the page, you know, so it has to be changed. So, you know, to work with the actors, to work with the setting, to work with the feel and tone of the film. But in this case, he didn't have to, for a lot of it.
He had it all in his head.
Yeah.
We'd like to take a brief moment to thank you for listening to Story Weavers. For the enjoyment of our listeners, we want to keep this podcast ad-free and uninterrupted.
If you would like to support us further, check out our options on Patreon. Plus, subscribing will get you behind-the-scenes content, bloopers, access to Book of the Month polls, and more. We appreciate any and all support.
Now back to the episode.
So this concludes our discussion on Dalton Trumbo's Johnny Got His Gun. We hope you enjoyed reading it along with us, or if you didn't, we hope you enjoyed the film, or you enjoyed listening to this episode. However you choose to interact with us, we're just happy that you're listening. For January 2024, we are going to go a completely different route than we have the last 2 months. We're going to stick with a shorter title, like we did this month, but we're going away from war. We are going away from heavy topics. And we are moving into the realm of fantasy, but not fantasy in the typical sense. We're going to be reading a book by a young author named Becky Chambers. We're going to be reading A Psalm for the Wild Built, which was released in 2021. It is part of an ongoing series that she's writing. I believe there are 2 of them out now, and the series is called Monk and Robot. And the book, it's childlike, it's heartfelt, it's a feel good book, and it's about this young man who's a monk. He sells tea. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic Earth. After we've gone through all of our, you know, technological advancements with robots and AI controlling the world, and this is after the downfall of all of that, and we're seeing, you know, a lot of greenery. It's interesting because it kind of harkens back to earlier times, you know, before electricity. And so this monk kind of wanders off on his own and meets a robot from the past, basically. And it's about their journey together and learning about, you know, each other. It's a very touching book. It's a quick read. I've listened to the audiobook. The narration was great. So that's the book we're going to be reading for next month. I have read this one. You know, John had read Johnny Got His Gun, and he had wanted me to read it. So we're swapping this time around. And so I also want to reread it because I do have the second book in the series that I want to read, but I want to go back and read A Psalm for the Wild Built first.
Yes.
But I've read a few books by Becky Chambers, and I highly recommend her. Yeah, they're very fun, very fanciful. She has really fun, you know, kind of unique characters. So yeah, we are looking forward to. I hope you're looking forward to it. I am looking forward to
very
rereading
much
it.
So. I know I am very much so. So once again, I just want to thank all of you for listening and for participating in this book of the month. I do hope you enjoyed Johnny Got His Gun by Dalton Trumbo. It left a lasting impact upon me, as I described, and I'm sure, as you could tell, Dean loved it as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
But not. It's weird saying like I love this book.
Yeah, I know.
I like the book. I love the story, but I don't like
grim.
it because of how it made me feel.
Oh yeah, no, it's one of those books you read.
I like it. It's a book that's I know we ended the episode, but I'm gonna bring up one more point here. The one thing I don't think you get from the film that you get from the book is the reflection. While you're reading the book, you know, you can, you know, when you're watching a movie, how often do you pause the movie to think? You don't pause. Most people don't pause a movie to think about what they just saw. You know, they'll either look it up online or they'll rewatch the movie and try and catch it. But with a book, you can pause, and you know, I did that a lot with this book and just stopped and thought.
Yep.
It was a very thought-provoking book, and I think that's why I liked it so much.
Yes. No, I agree. That this is one of those books, and it leaves a mark on you. I will say it leaves an indelible mark that even possibly years from now, you might just suddenly remember, or it at least changes the way you feel about things, which is the point of art to me. It changes the way you feel, or it amplifies something that you feel and legitimizes it and says, yes, you are good. You're okay.
Or it gives you a perspective you had never considered before. And then but the other thing about this is it leaves it up to the reader to decide. You know, you're very clear on what Dalton Trumbo's stance is.
Right.
But he still leaves it open-ended. He's not telling you what to do. He's asking you what you're going to do.
Yes. So, in conclusion, that's the end of this episode. Thank you for participating and reading Johnny Got His Gun. I hope you did enjoy it. And we hope to catch you next time on our next episode. Until then, this has been Story Weavers.
We'll see you in 2024.
Yes, see you next year. Thank you for listening to this episode of Story Weavers. As ever, we're incredibly grateful to all of our listeners and contributors. Come back next week for the next installment of Story Weavers.